Maria Santos spends her days cleaning the luxurious Hamilton mansion, enduring constant humiliation from Victoria Hamilton and her entitled children, who treat her as less than human. At 45, she's worked as their housekeeper for 15 years, sending every spare penny to help her daughter through medical school. But on a rainy Tuesday morning, as Victoria berates her for breaking an already cracked teacup, a sleek black car pulls into the driveway. Inside is a lawyer carrying news that will turn both their worlds upside down. Maria's long-lost uncle, who disappeared decades ago, has died and left her his entire fortune, including ownership of the company that employs Victoria's husband. What happens next will teach everyone an unforgettable lesson about karma, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth. Like and subscribe to follow this powerful story about how life can change in an instant and how true class has nothing to do with money. "You stupid woman!" Victoria Hamilton's voice echoed through the marble kitchen. "That cup was an heirloom. How dare you break it?" Maria Santos stood quietly, holding the pieces of the teacup that had been cracked long before she'd touched it. 15 years of experience had taught her it was useless to defend herself. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hamilton," she said softly, her accent still present despite decades in America. "I'll replace it." Victoria laughed cruelly. "Replace it? With what? Your entire year's salary couldn't buy one piece of my tea set." Maria thought of her daughter Carmen, now in her final year of medical school. Every insult she endured paid for another textbook, another step toward Carmen's dream. Mother. Charlotte Hamilton, Victoria's 16-year-old daughter, burst into the kitchen. "Maria hasn't ironed my riding clothes. I have lessons in an hour." "They're pressed and hanging in your closet, Miss Charlotte," Maria replied. "I did them first thing." "Don't talk back," Victoria snapped. "And don't forget your place. You're the help, nothing more." The doorbell rang, its deep chime interrupting Victoria's tirade. Through the kitchen window, Maria saw a black Rolls-Royce parked in the circular driveway. "Well," Victoria demanded, "answer it." Maria walked to the massive front door, her sensible shoes silent on the marble floor. Outside stood an elderly man in an expensive suit, holding a leather briefcase. "I'm looking for Maria Santos," he said formally. "I'm Maria." "I'm James Blackwood, from Blackwood & Associates law firm. May we speak privately? It's about your uncle, Roberto Mendez." Maria's heart skipped. Uncle Roberto had disappeared when she was a child in Brazil, leaving only stories of his adventures seeking fortune in America. "Maria!" Victoria's voice carried from the kitchen. "Who is it?" Mr. Blackwood raised an eyebrow at the tone. "Perhaps we should discuss this at my office," Victoria announced, appearing in the foyer. "The help doesn't take breaks during work hours." "Whatever you need to say can be said here." The lawyer's expression hardened slightly. "Very well. Ms. Santos, your uncle Roberto passed away last week, but you might know him better as Robert Mendez, founder of Mendez International Holdings." Victoria's face went pale. Mendez International was one of the largest companies in the country and the parent company of her husband's firm. "Before his death," Blackwood continued, "he amended his will. As his only living relative, you inherit everything. The company, the properties, his personal fortune, approximately $8.2 billion in total." The teacup pieces slipped from Maria's hand, shattering completely on the marble floor. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. "She's just a maid." "Was a maid," Blackwood corrected. "Ms. Santos is now your husband's boss and, given the corporate structure, effectively owns this house you're standing in." Maria thought of all the times she'd cleaned this marble floor on her hands and knees while the Hamiltons walked over it with muddy shoes. Of Charlotte's cruel pranks, of Victoria's daily humiliations. "Ms. Santos," Blackwood said gently. "Your uncle left you a letter. Would you like to read it privately?" But Maria straightened her spine, looking Victoria directly in the eyes for the first time in 15 years. "Number here is fine. After all, I wouldn't want to take a break during work hours." Mr. Blackwood opened his briefcase and pulled out a worn envelope. Maria's hands trembled as she recognized her uncle's handwriting. "My dearest Maria," she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If you're reading this, I've finally lost my battle with cancer. But I've been watching you for years, seeing your strength, your dignity, your kindness, despite how others treat you." Victoria had sunk into a foyer chair, her face ashen. Charlotte hovered in the doorway, for once silent. "When I left Brazil," the letter continued, "I promised your mother I'd make our family's fortune. I succeeded beyond my dreams, but success meant nothing without family to share it. I was too ashamed of abandoning you all to return. Instead, I watched from afar as you came to America, as you worked tirelessly to give your daughter an education, as you endured daily humiliations with grace." Maria paused, tears flowing freely now. "You built something remarkable. Not an empire of money, but an empire of character. Your daughter will be a doctor because of your sacrifice. Now it's time for you to live the life you deserve." Mr. Blackwood handed her another document. "This transfers ownership of Mendez International to you immediately, including, I should note, Hamilton Properties." Victoria found her voice. "You can't. James will never." "James Hamilton hasn't owned his company for years," Blackwood interrupted. "He's been borrowing against Mendez International's credit to keep it afloat. Miss Santos now owns everything, including all debts and obligations." Maria folded the letter carefully, then looked around the mansion she'd cleaned for 15 years. Every surface held memories of insults, of being treated as invisible, of swallowing her pride so Carmen could have a better life. "Mrs. Hamilton," she said quietly, "I need to give you notice. Today will be my last day as your housekeeper." Victoria's face reddened. "You think money makes you better than us? You'll always be just a—" "Money doesn't make anyone better or worse," Maria interrupted. "Kindness does that. Respect does that. Things you never understood." She turned to Blackwood. "My daughter's tuition." "Already transferred to her medical school account," he assured her, "along with funds for her residency and to set up her own practice when she's ready." Maria smiled, thinking of Carmen's dream to open a clinic serving low-income families. Perfect. Charlotte stepped forward, suddenly remembering all the times Maria had secretly comforted her after her mother's rages, had covered for her mistakes, had shown her the kindness Victoria never did. "Maria, I'm sorry for everything. I know, Miss Charlotte, sometimes the cruelest people are the ones hurting most themselves." She looked pointedly at Victoria. "But that's no excuse for how you treat others." The news spread quickly through Boston's elite social circles. By evening, the story was trending on social media. "Billionaire leaves fortune to housekeeper." But what really set tongues wagging was Maria's first act as owner of Mendez International. Rather than evict the Hamiltons or fire James from his position, she called a company-wide meeting. Every employee, from executives to janitors, was required to attend. "For 30 years, she began, standing at the podium in clothes she'd bought off the rack at Target, this company has been divided between those who sit in offices and those who clean them. Today, that changes." She announced a comprehensive restructuring. The minimum wage for all employees would be raised to $25 per hour. Executive salaries would be capped at 20 times the lowest workers' pay. Most surprisingly, she established a program where management would regularly work alongside maintenance staff. "To lead," she explained, "you must understand every aspect of what you're leading, including what it feels like to clean someone else's mess." James Hamilton, sitting in the front row, looked shell-shocked. His wife hadn't left their mansion since the news broke, but he had no choice but to face the music. "Mr. Hamilton," Maria addressed him directly, "you'll start next week. I believe Tuesday is when the bathrooms on the executive floor need cleaning." Some people gasped. Others tried to hide their smiles, but Maria wasn't done. "I'm also establishing the Carmen Santos Scholarship Fund, named after my daughter. It will provide full college funding for children of our service staff, because every parent deserves to see their child's dreams come true." After the meeting, James approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Santos, Maria, I want to apologize, not just for Victoria's behavior, but for my own, for never stepping in, never seeing me as human," Maria finished. "That's why you'll be cleaning bathrooms, Mr. Hamilton. Not as punishment, but as education. True respect comes from understanding." She looked around the office she'd cleaned countless times in pre-dawn hours. "You know what the strange thing is? I don't want revenge. I want change. Real, lasting change in how people treat each other." That evening, Maria returned to her small apartment one last time. Carmen was flying in from medical school, and Maria wanted to tell her the news in person. When Carmen arrived, she found her mother sitting at their tiny kitchen table, the same table where they'd counted pennies for textbooks, where they'd cried over rejection letters before the acceptance finally came, where they'd shared dreams that seemed impossible. "Ma," Carmen called out softly, "what's wrong? Your message said it was urgent." Maria looked up at her beautiful daughter, so close to becoming a doctor, and felt overwhelming pride. "Nothing's wrong, minha filha, but everything is about to change." Carmen sat stunned as her mother explained everything: Uncle Roberto, the inheritance, the company, the Hamiltons. When Maria finished, Carmen was crying. "All those years," she whispered, "all those times I begged you to quit when they treated you so badly." "It was worth it," Maria said softly. "Every moment led us here. And now, minha filha, you can open that clinic you've dreamed of. Help people who, like us, couldn't afford proper medical care." But Carmen was shaking her head. "First, we need to help someone else. Mom, I want you to get your degree." Maria blinked in surprise. "What? I've seen you reading my textbooks all these years, helping me study. You're brilliant, Mai. You just never had the chance. Now you do." The next morning, Maria walked into her new office at Mendez International headquarters. The room was bigger than their entire apartment. On the desk sat a framed photo she'd never seen before. Her as a child in Brazil, sitting on Uncle Roberto's lap. Her assistant, she had an assistant now, brought in her schedule. First appointment, Victoria Hamilton. Victoria entered the office like a different person. Subdued, nervous, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "Mrs. Hamilton," Maria greeted her calmly, "please sit." I came to beg you not to destroy us," Victoria said quietly. "James loves his work. Charlotte's college fund ... "Stop!" Maria held up her hand. "I'm not going to destroy anything, but I am going to change everything." She pulled out a folder. "Your household staff, the ones who replaced me, they all get raises, health insurance, college funds for their children. And you, Mrs. Hamilton, will volunteer twice a week at a homeless shelter. Not for show, but to learn what real struggle looks like." Victoria's mouth opened in protest, but Maria continued. "Charlotte's college fund is safe, but she'll work part-time throughout school like Carmen did. And James will keep his job, with some new responsibilities that might teach him humility." "Why?" Victoria whispered. "Why not just fire us all?" "Because money didn't make me cruel when I was poor, and it won't make me cruel now that I'm rich. But it will give me the power to create change. Real change." She stood, walking to the window overlooking the city. "You know what I realized? The truly wealthy aren't those with the most money. They're those with the most humanity." Victoria was crying now, really crying, not her usual theatrical tears. "I don't know how to be any other way." "Then learn," Maria said simply, "like I learned to clean houses, to speak English, to swallow my pride so my daughter could become a doctor. We can all learn to be better, Mrs. Hamilton, even you." 1 year later, Maria sat in a crowded auditorium, watching Carmen receive her medical degree. In the audience sat an unlikely group: James and Victoria Hamilton, Maria's entire office staff, and representatives from the 20 new low-income medical clinics that the Carmen Santos Foundation had opened across the city. Victoria sat quietly, a changed woman after her year of mandatory volunteer work. She'd surprised everyone, including herself, by continuing at the homeless shelter even after her required time was done. "They've taught me more about dignity than all my years in society," she'd admitted to Maria. James Hamilton had indeed cleaned bathrooms, mopped floors, and learned every aspect of the company he thought he'd known. He'd become one of Maria's strongest supporters in implementing changes throughout the corporation. But the biggest change was in Maria herself. At 46, she was halfway through her business degree, attending night classes after running the company during the day. Her professors often asked her to lecture about ethical business practices and corporate responsibility. After the graduation ceremony, Carmen hugged her mother tight. "I have a surprise for you," she whispered. She led Maria to the medical school's main hall, where a new wing was being dedicated. On the wall hung a large photograph of Maria in her housekeeper's uniform, next to one of her in her CEO's office. "The Maria Santos Wing for Community Medicine," Carmen announced proudly, "where we'll train doctors specifically to serve underprivileged communities." Maria touched the plaque with trembling fingers, remembering all the years she'd cleaned buildings like this one, never imagining she'd help shape what happened inside them. Victoria Hamilton stepped forward. "I'd like to announce something too." She looked at Maria nervously. "I'm donating half our family's fortune to fund scholarships for children of domestic workers, if that's all right." Maria hugged her former employer, feeling the wounds of the past finally heal completely. "It's more than all right. It's perfect." Later that evening, Maria returned to her uncle's, now her, mansion. But instead of rattling around the huge space alone, she'd converted half of it into a shelter for homeless families trying to get back on their feet. In her study, she looked at Roberto's photo. "I understand now, Tio," she said softly. "You didn't just leave me money. You left me a chance to prove that true wealth isn't in our bank accounts, it's in how we lift others up." On her desk sat a familiar teacup, the one she'd broken that fateful day. She'd had it repaired with gold in the Japanese tradition of kintsugi, where broken things are made more beautiful by their repair. Like the teacup, everything broken could be made whole again. Different perhaps, but stronger and more beautiful for having been broken. "Sometimes," she wrote in her company's new mission statement, "we must be broken to become who we're meant to be. But it's what we do after we're broken that defines us."